The first thing you need to understand is this. Kentucky in the 1970s was not just farmland, coal country, or forgotten hills. It was a place where silence had weight, where families locked their doors not out of habit, but out of primal fear. Because somewhere out there, in the thick woods and winding back roads, something was hunting them. Not an animal, not a rumor. A man. Flesh and blood, yes, but more than that. A shadow that slipped between the cracks of rural America, leaving children afraid to sleep, and mothers whispering to God in the dark. They called him many things over the years, sometimes a drifter, sometimes a ghost. But what he really was a monster in human skin. And the family at the center of this story lived every night knowing that death was circling their house like a wolf that had memorized the sound of their heartbeat. You have to picture it. A rickety home at the edge of a Kentucky town. The porch light burned through the night, not for welcome, but as warning. Windows sealed, curtains drawn. A father who slept with a shotgun by the door because he knew the law could not save them. The police in those days. They didn't want to admit what was happening. They wrote it off as coincidences. Accidents. A missing child here, a gutted pet there. But in the quiet corridors of certain county offices, they knew. They had reports that didn't add up. Witnesses who swore they saw something too tall, too strange, moving where no man should have been. And in that silence of denial, the killings began. This wasn't a normal killer. No, he was something worse. He studied fear. He understood how to make families collapse from the inside out. Before the blade, before the blood, he poisoned them with dread. By being seen at the window at midnight, by leaving small signs only the family would recognize. A torn piece of cloth. A child's toy left on the porch. He was not simply ending lives, he was dismantling the human soul. And the family at the center of this case, trapped, isolated, stalked, they became prisoners inside their own home. Their story is not simply about survival, it's about what happens when a community denies the monster in its midst, until that monster begins feasting on them one by one. Imagine a town where whispers travel faster than the wind, where everyone knows everyone's business, and yet no one dares to say what they've truly seen, because speaking it aloud feels like inviting it into your own home. That was Kentucky in the mid-1970s, when stories of missing farm hands and mutilated bodies found along forgotten creek beds began circulating like rumors too poisonous to swallow. You must understand, rural America was built on silence. People handled things themselves, without drawing attention, because to call for help meant admitting weakness. But silence has a price, and in this place, it was paid in blood. The man who hunted them thrived on that silence. He moved through the community as if wrapped in its very fabric, slipping past suspicion, feeding on the fact that no one wanted to believe a true predator could live among them. By day he was a face in town, indistinguishable from any working man with calloused hands and worn boots. By night he transformed into something primal, something stripped of conscience, a figure who studied his victims like a farmer studies the soil. He chose one family not by chance, but by design. He tested their doors, left signs in the dirt, watched them through the glass when the lights went out. The children would wake screaming that they saw someone standing in the hallway, but when the parents searched, the house was empty, save for a lingering chill in the air. And what do you do when the law shrugs? When the sheriff says it's just imagination? When neighbors look away because acknowledging evil makes it real? You start to unravel inside. This family began to live in shifts. One always awake, listening for footsteps, the other half sleeping with a weapon by the bed. Days bled into nights, fear gnawed at their sanity, and still the killer waited. He didn't strike immediately. No, he savored the game. He wanted the air world to collapse from within before he ever spilled their blood. And that is the secret few dare to admit about killers like him. Their true power is not in the knife or the rope, but in their ability to colonize the human mind, to make their prey live as though death has already claimed them. The family's descent began in the smallest of ways, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't watching closely, but for them it was undeniable. Doors that had been locked were found open in the morning, kitchen chairs slightly moved as though someone had stood there for hours listening to the breath of the sleepers, the family dog barking madly at empty corners, until one night it was found dead just beyond the tree line, its neck broken clean, as if by a hand that delighted in silence. From that moment forward, the children refused to play outside after dusk, and the mother began placing crucifixes above every window, though her faith had never before required such gestures, while the father grew paranoid and restless, roaming the house at night with a shotgun clutched to his chest, whispering that he saw shadows moving beyond the tree line, shadows that paused as if watching him back. He knew this wasn't random violence, it was a siege, a campaign of psychological warfare designed to wear them thin, to strip them of their belief in safety until every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps coming closer. The killer was not rushing. He was patient, savoring each fragment of fear he extracted from them, and he wanted them to break long before he ever touched them, because broken prey was easier to dismantle. And still the community pretended nothing was wrong. Neighbors avoided eye contact. The sheriff dismissed the family's terror as imagination, a trick of the woods, maybe even hysteria. But the truth is, institutions do not like to admit that evil slips past their fences, so they gaslight, they deny, they leave you alone in the dark until your screams are the only evidence that something unnatural walks among you. And here is where you must understand the true nature of control. Governments, churches, lawmen, they thrive on the belief that monsters are myth, that predators can always be stopped by order and authority. But when a true monster arises, when a man becomes something more feral than beast, yet more calculating than genius, those institutions retreat, leaving families like this one to rot inside their own homes, left to face the nightmare alone, while the world outside turns its head away, pretending the blood isn't already soaking into the soil. Night after night, the family endured the slow unraveling of their sanity, their home transforming from a place of refuge into a cage where every wall carried the weight of dread, the children waking with nosebleeds and night terrors, as if the fear itself was carving its way into their small bodies, the mother praying until her voice was raw, while leaving bowls of salt and water by the door, not because she believed in superstition, but because she was desperate to create any barrier at all, while the father's temper grew violent under the strain, snapping at his family, not because he hated them, but because he hated his own powerlessness, the shame of knowing he could not defend them from a force that seemed to slip through locks and shadows with ease. And outside, in the fields, strange signs began to appear. Animal carcasses arranged in circles, sticks tied together in twisted shapes left on the fence posts, warnings that spoke a language older than words, as though the killer wasn't just playing with them, but performing some ritual of domination, a reminder that they belonged to him before he even laid a hand on them. And this is the truth men don't want to face. Violence does not always come crashing in. Sometimes it seeps in drop by drop, eroding the foundation of your will until you've already surrendered before the knife ever touches your throat. And that was the state of this family in Kentucky, already conquered in spirit, already breathing as though they were living on borrowed time, and the institutions that could have saved them did nothing, because fear itself is a system of control. And when ordinary men see terror staring back at them, they turn away, leaving only the hunted and the hunter in the night. So the family was left alone, every light burning through the darkness like a desperate beacon, but even they knew deep inside that the lights could not save them, for the monster had already mapped their souls, had already crawled into their dreams, and was simply waiting for the perfect moment when their last thread of hope would snap. It began on a night when the wind refused to rest, dragging across the roof like 1,000 claws, and the family sat huddled together in the single room where the fireplace glowed weak and thin, each of them pretending the crackling of the wood was enough to drown out the silence pressing in from outside. But then the silence shattered with a sound so deliberate it froze their blood. The creak of the back door opening, slow, cautious, like a man savoring the moment before stepping into another's life, and the father leapt up with the rifle in his hand, though his palms were slick with sweat and his knees shook under the weight of his fear. But when he flung the door wide, there was nothing there except the cold, the moonlight spilling across the field where the shapes of twisted sticks had been arranged into a circle that hadn't been there before, still damp with soil as if freshly placed. The children clung to their mother, whispering prayers through cracked lips, while the father fired into the dark, one blind shot that echoed through the valley like a declaration of war. Yet the only answer was the faintest laugh, low, mocking, carried on the wind, so close he could swear it was inside the walls with them. And from that night on, they no longer questioned whether something was out there. They knew, because every step, every breath, every glance over their shoulder confirmed that they were no longer the owners of their home, but the subjects of a hunter who toyed with them as a cat toys with a mouse. And this is the most unbearable truth of terror. Not that it comes with teeth bared, but that it comes with patience, circling, waiting, teaching you that your courage means nothing when every moment of quiet could be the moment before the blade. And so the family's world collapsed inward, their lives shrinking to the glow of a single fire, the father watching every shadow until his eyes burned, the mother whispering to God until her faith felt like a hollow shell, and the children drifting into sleep only to wake screaming at the sound of footsteps pacing just outside their windows, too rhythmic, too intentional, never hurrying, always reminding them that the night belonged not to them, but to him. The first true violation came not with broken glass or splintered doors, but with something so small it might have been dismissed as forgetfulness, if not for the weight of the silence that followed it. For when the mother awoke in the gray light before dawn and shuffled across the wooden floor to stir the ashes of the fire, her eyes caught upon the rocking chair near the window, gently swaying though no draught stirred the air, and resting on its seat was the youngest child's doll, porcelain face cracked and one glassy eye turned sideways, though the mother swore she had tucked it beneath the girl's arm when she kissed her to sleep, and the child now stirred on the cot without it, clutching nothing but her own hair between her fingers, as though she had been twisting it in terror. The father tried to dismiss it, muttering that perhaps one of the children had moved it in the night, though his voice cracked under the strain of pretending, and when he set the doll back into the girl's arms, he noticed the faintest smear across its pale cheek. Dark, dried, almost like soil rubbed into the paint. And before the mother could draw breath to question, the father pulled the shutters closed, slammed the latch, and barked that no one leave the house that day, though he would not say why. But as the hours dragged on, with the children growing restless and the mother pacing the small room, they all began to feel it, that something had changed in the air, that their walls were no longer barriers but only thin skins holding back a presence that could enter as easily as a breath. And when night fell again, the father kept his rifle across his knees, yet his eyes were drawn again and again to the rocking chair in the corner, waiting for it to sway on its own, knowing in his bones that whatever had entered their home had not come to steal, nor to harm outright, but to announce its power in the smallest ways first, like the opening lines of a long, deliberate game, one that would not end until they understood that every object in their home, every corner of shadow, every breath they dared to take belonged to it, not them. And the doll, with its crooked smile and soil-stained cheek, was no longer a child's toy. It was a signature, the proof that they were already losing. That night the house itself seemed to grow restless, its old timbers creaking not with the familiar groans of settling wood, but with the rhythm of something deliberate, a weight shifting from one board to another, as though feet were pressing down on planks that no one in the family dared step upon. And when the father whispered sharply for silence, every child froze beneath their blankets, eyes wide in the darkness, listening. The sound moved slowly at first, a dragging step across the farthest corner of the single-room cabin, then another, closer, heavier, as though whatever had entered during the day now tested its ownership of the night. And though the father gripped the rifle until his knuckles whitened, he could not bring himself to rise, for every instinct screamed that standing would mean seeing, and seeing would mean surrender. So he sat rigid, heart pounding, while the mother pressed her hand over her mouth to smother a scream, her other hand stretching blindly across the cot to pull the youngest child into her arms, the doll slipping from the girl's grasp to land face down on the floorboards with a dull crack that seemed to echo too loud in the charged silence. And then it came, the unmistakable sound of the rocking chair shifting, slow and steady, creaking forward, then back, forward, then back, though not a single draft stirred the air. And as the rhythm quickened, it seemed almost to laugh in its motion, as if mocking the paralysis of the family who dared not breathe too loud, dared not cry out, dared not challenge what had claimed its seat by the window. And when the sound finally ceased, when the boards lay quiet again and the rocking stilled, they realized with a shudder that the presence had not left but had settled into its chosen corner, sitting invisible yet undeniable, watching them through the long hours until dawn, and in that endless waiting, the children learned what their parents already knew, that their home had been taken, and whatever now lived with them did not plan to leave. When morning came, it did not bring relief, but a heavier silence, a silence so thick it seemed to press down on every beam of the house. For the father rose to find the rocking chair angled away from the window now, turned instead toward the cots where his children had huddled in terror, and though no one had touched it, though every child swore they had not moved from their beds, the chair faced them like a judge, poised as if it had been studying their faces through the long night, deciding which among them would weaken first. The youngest girl clutched her doll to her chest again, but the toy felt different in her arms, colder somehow, as if it had spent the night in someone else's grasp. And when her mother reached to stroke her hair, the child whispered that she had heard a voice. Soft, steady, coaxing, from the darkness, a voice that told her she was special, that she didn't belong to her family anymore, that she was meant for something else. And though her parents tried to hush her, tried to insist it was only a dream, the look in her eyes was not the vacant gaze of sleep, but the clear, haunted certainty of a child who had been spoken to directly. By midday the family began to hear faint whispers themselves, low threads of sound that seemed to seep from the corners of the room, slipping in and out of the walls like the breath of someone hidden just beyond the threshold of sight. And no matter where they moved, no matter how they tried to distract themselves with chores or prayer, the whispers followed, never distinct, never in words they could name, but always with the same rhythm, the same pulling cadence that made the skin prickle and the chest tighten, as if the house itself was breathing with them, watching, waiting for the moment when one of them would finally answer back. That night, the youngest girl stirred in her sleep, though it was not the restless shifting of a child caught in nightmare, but the slow, deliberate movements of someone rising to a summons, her small frame lifting from the cot with unnerving calm, her doll dragging against the floor as she stepped into the gloom, her eyes open yet glassy, reflecting nothing of herself within them, and though her mother reached to catch her, to pull her back under the quilt, her hand recoiled at the sudden chill radiating from the child's skin, as if she had been lying outside on frozen earth rather than beneath a blanket. The girl moved past them all without a word, the rocking chair creaking to life as though it had been waiting for her, swaying before she even reached it, and when she placed the doll upon the seat, the chair stilled instantly, no longer rocking, as if appeased by the offering, though in that stillness the air seemed to tighten, the whispers swelling into a soft chorus that filled the house with unbearable weight, each voice overlapping, coaxing, pressing, until the father shouted for them to stop, his words trembling with rage and fear. But the sound died in his throat when he saw his daughter turn her head slowly toward him, her lips parting in a smile too wide, too knowing, the smile of something that had studied him all along, and was now wearing the face of his child. And when she spoke, her voice carried not the sweet pitch of youth, but a layered echo, older than time, telling him they had been welcomed, that the family's suffering had purchased entry, that now the house was no longer theirs, it had never been theirs. And in that instant, every member of the family realized the truth. The youngest had not been chosen by accident. She had been chosen because she was the weakest thread in their bond, the one whose innocence could be inverted, whose love could be turned into the cruelest vessel. And as she stepped back from the chair, leaving the doll behind, the house seemed to settle with satisfaction, as though it had taken its first true breath in years. From that moment forward, the youngest child was never entirely theirs again, for though she still laughed at times and reached for her mother's hand, her eyes would linger too long on corners where no one stood, her lips moving soundlessly as though reciting lines only she could hear, and the rest of the family began to move about the house in an unspoken terror, avoiding the rocking chair even when it sat perfectly still, avoiding the doll even when it looked as lifeless as cloth and straw should, because each of them knew, without ever daring to speak it, that something had stepped into their home and made a claim through her, something that thrived on silence, obedience, and the slow corrosion of faith. At night the father prayed louder than ever, his voice shaking the rafters, but the words fell flat, mocked by soft tapping sounds from the walls, the rhythm not random but deliberate, imitating the cadence of his psalms, as though to prove that prayer itself was now being echoed by a darker mouth. The mother's hair began to gray at the temples from worry, her fingers raw from scrubbing the floors, as if cleanliness could drive away what lived beneath the boards. And the older children whispered among themselves that their sister was no longer truly their sister, but a mask worn by something watching them through her, waiting to see which of them would break first. For in their sleep they all heard her voice, not in dreams, but in the waking dark, when their eyes were open and their hearts were thundering, whispering their names from beside the bed, though when they turned, she was never there, only the lingering echo of her giggle slipping back into the walls. And in that slow torment, the family understood they were not fighting an invader that had entered from without, but an inheritance that had always been buried in the ground beneath them, patient, waiting for a else soft enough, innocent enough to wear like a second skin. And now that it had found her, there would be no simple banishment, no prayer strong enough to burn it out, only the gnawing question of how far it meant to take its possession, and how much of the family it intended to consume before the end. The father, unable to endure the slow unraveling of his household, sought out the oldest man left alive in their ridge country, a withered hermit named Elijah Carr, who was said to have seen the world before roads carved the mountains and before churches dared to set their bells ringing in hollows that belonged to older powers. Elijah lived in a shack roofed with tin and moss, his eyes clouded but sharp with knowing. And when the father explained, haltingly, shame burning his throat, that his youngest daughter laughed at shadows, spoke to walls, and called out names that were not her own, Elijah only nodded, as if the story were as familiar as rain, then spat tobacco into the dirt, and told him that some families were born to carry burdens older than memory, that bloodlines carried curses the way streams carried silt, and that no hymn would untie what had been knotted before the first church was raised. Instead, Elijah pressed a bundle of objects into his hands, rusted nails blackened by fire, strands of horsehair, a vial of bitter root, and a shard of mirror wrapped in cloth, and instructed him to bury these at the four corners of the homestead, to never speak of the ritual aloud, and to forbid the child from ever playing near the creek again, for water was a doorway the thing inside her would use if it could. But when the father returned home and performed the burial, whispering Elijah's words under his breath like a thief in his own land, the air grew colder, the fields more silent, as if the earth itself paused to listen, and for a few days there was peace. No laughter from the shadows, no tapping in the walls. Yet on the seventh night, as the mother washed her face in a basin by candlelight, she saw her daughter's reflection appear in the water, though the girl was asleep in another room, and the reflection grinned with a mouth too wide, showing teeth that did not belong to, oh, a child. And in that moment, the mother knew the ritual had not banished the presence, but had marked them more deeply, had told the thing that they acknowledged it, feared it, and had tried to bind it, and from then on, it no longer hid itself behind subtlety, but began to spread, touching each member of the family in ways tailored to their own weakness, like a hand tightening threads in a web that had already been spun long before they were born. From the moment Elijah's ritual failed and the reflection smiled from the basin, the family seemed to be living inside something else's patience, as if they were insects in a jar waiting for the air to thin. The eldest son was the first to falter, waking in the night with the feeling of fingers pressed hard against his throat. Though no one stood near him, his sheets damp with sweat and the smell of iron heavy in the air, and by morning he could not bring himself to eat, his once strong frame shrinking over weeks, until his shoulders curved inward and he muttered constantly about the man in the rafters who whispered through the wood. The mother grew brittle and silent, her hands raw from scrubbing the same patch of floor that was never dirty. Her lips cracked from whispering prayers in a voice too low to hear, and when asked what she was doing she would not answer, only glance toward the window as if someone stood outside waiting for her signal. The father, though he had buried the charms and repeated the old man's warnings, felt his authority draining like water through rotted planks, for every night he woke to sounds of chairs dragging across the floor or spoons clattering in the cupboard. Yet when he struck matches to chase the intruder, nothing stirred except the youngest daughter, who now sat awake with her eyes wide open, humming songs that no one had taught her, songs older than English, older than hymns. And though the family tried to hold their life together, chopping wood, tending the mule, eating cornbread by lamplight, it was as though their home had been hollowed out, a theater for something unseen that delighted in watching them crack. Neighbors who once traded salt and flour no longer came by, for they had heard stories of lights moving in the Maddox cabin at hours no one kept, of children's laughter drifting across the ridge when the fields lay empty, and whispers spread that the blood of that family had always been wrong, that their kin had been midwives for things not human in the mountains, and whether true or not, the isolation sealed them in with their torment, until even silence carried weight, pressing against their skulls, daring them to admit that their undoing was not coming from outside, but from within, pulled thread by the youngest child, who now never blinked when she smiled. The father, unable to endure the unraveling any longer, took to the woods at dusk with a lantern swinging in his hand, hunting not for game, but for answers, following the half-remembered trails of old folk who were said to live beyond the ridges, men and women who had outlived whole towns by trading something of themselves to the unseen. He carried in his pocket a strip of cloth from his daughter's dress, still damp from her fever sweat, as if it might serve as proof of his desperation, and when he reached a clearing marked by stones that should not have been there, perfectly round and stacked without mortar, he whispered into the trees as if speaking to an ear that was not flesh, begging for guidance, begging for reprieve, promising blood or silence or even his own life if the thing in his house would let his children be. The forest answered in its own way, not with words, but with a wind that came against the branches, though no storm brewed, and the lantern flame flickered sideways as though something had passed just behind him, and in the silence that followed, he thought he heard his daughter's humming, carried from far off, the same melody she sang in the cabin, though no child could have wandered so deep in the night. He dropped the lantern then, the glass shattering, yet the flame did not die. It crawled along the moss in a thin line, guiding his eyes to a crude shape carved into one of the stones, a circle split by a jagged line like a wound, and beneath it what could only be read as an invitation or a command, a sign that if he wished to turn the curse, he must do so by breaking something living. He staggered back toward the cabin, his mind burning with the image, and when he entered, the family sat at the table in complete stillness, as though awaiting his verdict. The children pale, The mother, with her cracked lips parted, as if she had known what he would find. And there in the dim lamplight, the youngest daughter finally lifted her eyes, wide and unblinking, and whispered in a voice too calm for a child, "It's already chosen, Papa. It just waits for you to decide." The father's breath rattled in his chest as he stood there, his boots sinking into the dirt floor, the air thick with the scent of kerosene and sweat, and he felt for the first time that his own home had become a kind of stage, the family seated like an audience watching him wrestle with an unseen script already written for him. He wanted to speak, to deny the child's words, but his tongue felt swollen, heavy, as though some hand pressed it down, and in that suffocating silence the youngest daughter's smile spread just a fraction too far, a grimace that belonged not to her but to something using her face, and the boy on her left began tapping his fingernails against the table in a slow, deliberate rhythm. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, a cadence that echoed the heartbeat pounding in the father's skull. The mother's gaze flicked to him then, not in pleading, but in resignation, as if she too had walked this path in her mind and found no escape at the end of it. And the father felt the carved mark in the woods burning behind his eyes, the circle with its wound whispering what had to be done, demanding a breaking, a sacrifice, a shattering of the fragile balance that held his family in the world of the living. He reached for the knife on the table, his fingers trembling, but before he could even lift it, the daughter leaned forward, her voice no longer carrying the tremble of a child, but the steady cadence of something ancient. "If you won't choose, it will choose for you," she said. And as the words left her mouth, the lantern flame in the room swelled and bent unnaturally, shadows stretching across the walls like grasping hands, and the boy's tapping grew louder until it became a pounding that made the dishes jump, and the mother's shoulders sagged as if crushed by invisible weight. The father felt then that the choice was no longer about saving one or all, but about whether he would accept his role in the thing that had already rooted itself into the marrow of his bloodline, a role he had never asked for yet could not refuse. And in the echoing silence after the child's words, he realized that whatever force had marked them did not want escape, did not want bargaining. It wanted participation, it wanted complicity, and it was waiting with infinite patience for him to make the first cut. The father's knuckles whitened around the knife handle, as though the steel itself might anchor him to some reality still within reach, yet even as he lifted it from the table, he knew the act was not his own, but guided, as if invisible strings had threaded into his wrist, drawing the blade upward with ritual precision. The children did not flinch, did not scream, but watched with the kind of cold fascination one might see in birds circling a carcass, and the mother's lips moved soundlessly, either prayer or curse. It was impossible to tell. Her eyes locked not on the blade, but on the children, as though she knew the cut was meant less for flesh than for the spell that bound them. But then the girl with the wrong smile leaned forward again, her eyes blackened not with shadow, but with depth, like pits that stretched far beyond human comprehension, and she whispered a single word, one syllable, sharp and guttural, that seemed to slam through the air like a hammer, and the father's body buckled, the knife clattering to the dirt floor as his chest seized with a pain that wasn't his own, as though he was feeling the heartbeat of something enormous and ancient thrumming inside his ribs. The boy's tapping stopped instantly, replaced by silence so complete it seemed to erase the world beyond the cabin, and the lantern's glow drew inward, shrinking until the room was lit only by the pale glow of the children's eyes. And the father realized then, with dreadful clarity, that the force had only ever used the knife as a distraction. It did not need his hand to act, because it already lived in their mouths, in their eyes, in their blood, and now, as the daughter's voice rippled through him like molten lead, he saw the truth of the mark in the woods. It was not a warning, it was an invitation, a doorway flung wide, and his family had already stepped through it, leaving him alone in the threshold, trembling, while the thing that wore his children waited for him to follow. His chest heaved like a bellows as the pain coursed through him, but in the trembling gasp that followed, he forced himself upright, clawing at the table for support, sweat streaking his brow, his vision a blur of shadow and firelight. And in that haze he thought, no, he knew. He saw his son and daughter no longer as children, but as vessels, their small frames stretched by something older than language, their skin flickering with patterns like oil shifting on water, their mouths curved in grins that were not human grins, but sigils drawn in flesh. He staggered forward, one arm extended toward them in some instinctive gesture of fatherhood, the way a man reaches to protect his child from fire, and for a split second he saw their faces soften, saw the boy's tapping hand twitch as though a memory of who he had once been tried to claw its way back to the surface. But then the girl hissed, the sound dry and serpentine, her jaw unhinging wider than bone should allow, and the illusion collapsed, the children's bodies twisting in a blur of joints bending the wrong way, their shadows breaking free of their forms and crawling along the walls like independent things. And the mother screamed, not words, not even sound, but a tearing shriek that seemed to shred the air itself. And still the father reached forward, his heart cracking under the weight of something he could not fight, whispering their names as though names might pull them back, but each syllable only seemed to make the thing stronger, until the shadows on the wall weren't shadows at all, but other faces, dozens, hundreds, grinning, hungry, and the truth came down upon him like a hammer to the skull. His children were not being taken. They had been chosen, and the curse had not just found them, it had been waiting for this night, waiting for him to watch. He stumbled backward, but there was no retreat left in that house, for every corner now seemed alive with the weight of centuries pressing in on him, the wood groaning with voices that were not voices, but the murmurs of bargains struck long before his children were born, and in that moment he saw clearly what the curse demanded, not their blood, not their screams, but his consent, his surrender to let them pass fully into whatever waited beyond the veil of flesh, because curses are not thefts, they are contracts, and he was the final signature. The boy's hand stopped its erratic tapping, and instead beat in steady rhythm against his thigh, a rhythm older than time, a calling drumbeat that resonated with the very bones of the house, while the girl's wide, impossible mouth whispered a name he had never taught her, a name that seemed to slice into his skull with icy fire, and though he covered his ears, the sound seeped through, because names like that were not meant to be spoken aloud, but to awaken in the marrow, and he felt it stirring inside him like worms under his skin, rewriting him into something complicit. His wife clawed at her throat as if trying to rip the sound out before it could root itself. Her eyes, rolling white as foam, bubbled from her lips, but the children did not falter, their shadows multiplying, circling, enclosing, until he was no longer in a room, but in a cavern of faces, faces that smiled with his children's eyes, but not his children's souls. And through the pressure in his chest, through the copper taste of blood rising in his mouth, he knew with bone-deep certainty that if he did not bend, if he did not give them his wordless blessing, the curse would not stop with them. It would spill out, seeping into every bloodline, every village, every cradle in the valley, until the world itself was no more than a nursery for the damned. The father dropped to his knees, his palms slapping the warped boards that seemed to breathe beneath him, the house rising and falling as if inhaling his terror, and in that suffocating darkness he understood that resistance was nothing but theater, for the curse had not come to test his strength, but to break his will, to force him to choose between being the jailer or the key. And as his children's bodies convulsed with that otherworldly rhythm, their bones, snapping like green branches yet never shattering, reforming into shapes he could not name, he realized that if he let go, if he said yes, the curse would claim them entirely, leaving only husks. And yet if he clung to no, if he clung to fatherhood like a shield, The house itself would turn its hunger upon them all, ripping apart their flesh, their bloodlines, until nothing remained but stains on the floor. The boy's eyes locked with his, and for an instant it was not his son staring back, but an ancient thing wearing a child's mask, demanding payment in the only language men understand, sacrifice, and the girl's voice, stretched and shredded by a throat too small for the enormity of what it carried, whispered again that forbidden name, only louder now, a name he knew would burn a hole straight through him if he ever dared repeat it, and his wife collapsed beside him, her hands still clawing her own throat, her face purpled with lack of breath, her gaze pleading with him in the last fragments of her human clarity. It was then, trembling and weeping into the rotting boards, that he felt the full machinery of the curse bearing down upon him, a crushing inevitability, and he understood that curses are never accidents. They are inheritances, waiting for the moment when a man kneels before the impossible and either damns himself by refusing or damns the world by accepting. And in that unholy instant, the choice became his too. O make, though it was no choice at all, because the curse had written it centuries before his bloodline ever drew its first breath. And so, with the boards rising and falling like the ribs of some colossal beast, with his children writhing in convulsions that seemed more ritual than suffering, with his wife twitching in the grip of strangulation by invisible hands, the father broke. Not with words, but with the bowing of his spine, the surrender of his shoulders, the trembling exhale that tasted of old dust and grave dirt, a surrender so complete that even the house seemed to still, as though the curse itself paused to savor the moment of his defeat. And in that pause he felt something ancient slide into him, not as a possession, but as a graft, as though his marrow had been exchanged for something darker, older, hungrier. And at once he understood why this house had never rotted, why its timbers groaned like lungs, why its walls whispered names in the night. It was not a structure but a covenant, a prison built for a god that had been starved of flesh, and his family had been chosen not as victims, but as officiants of its reawakening, and now his children's eyes, both shining with that dreadful light, looked upon him not as father, but as vessel, their bodies no longer fighting against the convulsions, but dancing with them, matching the unseen rhythm, their twisted limbs forming angles that suggested geometry no sane man could sketch. And when their mouths opened together in a shriek that did not carry pain but proclamation, he felt the curse root itself deeper into the soil, into the bones of the valley, into the marrow of every descendant yet unborn. And he knew in his soul that what had been passed down to him was not a burden he could resist, but a role he was born to play. That resistance was an illusion, that even his defiance had been part of the script written centuries before, and though he wanted to scream, though he wanted to claw his eyes out to unsee what he had become, the only sound that escaped him was a broken prayer to no God who could hear, for the house had already claimed the throne of his soul, and there was no undoing its reign. The children's transformation was not immediate but incremental, grotesque in its patience, for their bones did not snap nor shatter, but bent, as though softened into pliant wax under some invisible fire, their spines arching in synchrony until their bodies formed crescents, their limbs elongating in ways that mocked human proportion, their skin paling until it resembled the very boards of the house, as if the structure were rewriting them in its own image. And the father, in the delirium of his horror, realized they were not being killed. They were being absorbed, not consumed in the crude sense of devouring, but assimilated. Their blood and flesh translated into architecture, every convulsion aligning them closer with the grain of the floor, every shriek filling the rafters with resonance that did not dissipate but hung like incense, a permanent note in the house's hymn. And as he crawled forward on his knees, reaching for them, though his hands trembled like a supplicant begging before an altar, he saw their eyes, those terrible, glowing eyes, fade not into death, but into vacancy, their irises replaced by tiny knotted whorls like the growth rings of trees, marking years, marking age, marking eternity, and with a clarity that burned like acid in his gut. He knew they were not leaving him, not disappearing into some void, but remaining forever within the house, folded into its marrow, becoming the unrotting beams, the creaking floorboards, the sighing doors, so that their laughter and screams would never stop, but would haunt every visitor, every generation that dared step inside. And the house itself pulsed with satisfaction, the way a predator's stomach ripples after feeding, its silence now thicker, heavier, triumphant. And he, broken on the floor with his bloodied hands pressed into wood that was no longer wood, but his children's living flesh, understood at last that the curse was not a punishment, but a binding contract, a pact signed in generations of anguish, and in his failure to resist, he had not merely lost his family. He had guaranteed that the Halbert name would never escape the house's hunger, for it had claimed them not as victims, but as building blocks in its eternal body. The wife's silence had not been resignation, but a gathering storm, for as her children were twisted into the marrow of the house, she did not scream or thrash like her husband, but sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes glazed yet strangely resolute, as though she had always known this moment would come. And when her husband turned to her, desperate, broken, begging with the cracked voice of a man already half buried, he saw not terror, but recognition, and she whispered something he almost mistook for a prayer, but realized too late was an oath, a yielding not to God, but to the house itself. And in that instant her body changed, not with the grotesque bending of the children, but with a slow, deliberate unraveling, her skin paling until it resembled old parchment, her hair loosening in strands that did not fall to the ground but drifted upward like smoke, clinging to the ceiling as though claimed by unseen fingers, and her lips moved in rhythm with the walls, speaking words he could not understand, but that the house answered, every plank shivering, every nail humming with acknowledgement, until her voice was no longer hers, but theirs, fused into the chorus of the damned who dwelt within, and she lifted her gaze to him one final time, her face radiant with both sorrow and triumph, and he realized in despair that she was not being taken against her will, but had chosen this, had entered the pact willingly, and her flesh cracked like clay, peeling away in sheets that revealed beneath her not blood or bone, but dry, fibrous matter, strands of root and vein intertwining, knitting themselves into the floorboards, into the joists, until she was no longer his wife, but a living seam binding the house together, her last whispered breath sinking into the air like a curse. And he knew then with an unbearable clarity that the house did not merely feast upon them, but recruited them. Demi seduced them, made them a part of its eternal design, and that he stood alone, the last Halbert left with flesh unclaimed, doomed to wander its rooms with his grief as the only voice that still belonged to him, even as the walls pulsed with his family's murmurs, calling him not with malice but with a promise, that he too would join them, that resistance was nothing more than prolonging the inevitable. But torment was not a word vast enough for what the father endured, for while his children had been claimed swiftly and his wife had surrendered with an almost ceremonial grace, he was left untouched, not out of mercy, but because the house wanted him to feel every second of loss, every drip of silence, every echo of voices that once called him father and husband, now seeping from the walls in tones that were familiar, yet distorted, like lullabies sung backward. And so he staggered through the corridors, clawing at his ears, calling their names, though he knew he was only feeding the hunger that surrounded him, and in his wandering he saw things he could not unsee, portraits that shifted when his eyes passed over them, his family's faces stretched into grotesque proportions as if laughing at his useless grief, chairs that rocked without weight in them, hearth ashes stirred though no fire had burned for hours, releasing sparks that hovered in the air like watching eyes, and every stair groaned not beneath his step, but in time with his heartbeat, as though the whole structure was learning his rhythm, syncing with it, preparing to absorb it, and yet it held him back, not rushing the final act, but savoring his unraveling, because unlike the others he had not yielded, and that resistance made him more valuable, more nourishing, for the house craved the breaking of will even more than the taking of flesh, and so, night after night, he refused sleep, clutching his rosary until the beads cut deep into his palm, whispering prayers not for deliverance, but for endurance. And yet the voices answered his prayers with mockery, twisting scripture into riddles, promising that God had no dominion here, that stone and timber were older than church and creed, that what he prayed to was powerless, and what he stood inside was eternal, and still he resisted, dragging himself to the cellar with he foolish notion of fire, of ending it all, striking flint with trembling hands, but the sparks fell dead, suffocated before they could breathe, for the air itself would not allow his rebellion, and he fell to his knees weeping, realizing he was not a man in a house, but a prisoner inside a stomach, still alive only because digestion had not yet been finished. And so he lingered in that endless twilight, losing the days, losing his voice, while the house whispered to him of relief, of release, of how sweet it would be to stop resisting and let the walls close in. And though he spat curses into the dark, though he vowed never to yield, the truth clawed at his chest, that the longer he fought, the more the house savored him, and that in time his defiance would not save his soul, but only flavor it. And so the deeper one looks into the hollow-eyed truth of what happened in that forgotten Kentucky hollow, the clearer it becomes that this was never just the story of one family's decline, but a mirror turned toward America itself, a mirror that reflects the consequences of silence, neglect, and the willful burying of inconvenient horrors. The records of the Appalachia family are fragmented, scattered in courthouse basements and weather-stained Bibles. But what emerges is a portrait of generational rot, an inheritance of madness passed not merely through blood, but through whispered rites, unholy pacts, and the careful preservation of knowledge that should never have been written down. A family that believed itself chosen, set apart, protectors of a secret that could shape men's lives if wielded correctly, gradually turned inward until their doctrines and customs became indistinguishable from madness. And yet, even as outsiders recoiled from them, the Appalachians were consulted in whispers. Judges, preachers, and businessmen alike sought their counsel in shadows, taking from their house the very poison they would later denounce. That is the hypocrisy at the heart of this story. A community that condemned them publicly while feeding on their dark knowledge privately, a system that declared them degenerate while exploiting their curse for its own ends. Their collapse, then, was no isolated tragedy, but a ritual sacrifice engineered by the same society that pretended to fear them. And the final question, the one that lingers like smoke in the rafters of their ruined home, is not what destroyed them, but what survived them. Because the evidence suggests that not all the family perished, not all their pages burned, and not all their secrets died in that Kentucky hollow. There are stories of descendants who walk among us still, their names changed, but their eyes marked with the wool. Same cold fire, keeping alive traditions older than the nation itself, traditions that thrive in secrecy, feeding on our forgetfulness. Which leaves us here, staring into the abyss that the Appalachia family once called its inheritance, forced to ask whether their madness was truly their own, or whether it was a shadow cast by something older, darker, and still moving beneath the skin of America. The crescendo is not in the fire that consumed their homestead, or the graves that swallowed their children, but in the fact that the Appalachia family's curse was never confined to bloodlines or geography. It was an infection of thought, an architecture of belief that rewired how those who touched it saw power, ritual, and destiny, and like all infections, it found new hosts. A preacher who once walked up that hollow to pray over the sick returned to his church with sermons that dripped with venom, convincing his flock that salvation required suffering. A judge who consulted the Appalachians before signing land decrees left his descendants with titles to stolen property and nightmares of faces pressed against glass. A physician who borrowed their remedies went on to conduct trials that history remembers as innovation, but were, in truth, cruelty dressed as progress. These men prospered, their names etched into plaques and textbooks, while the Appalachians were left to rot in collective memory as scapegoats. Yet the root of their legacy lives on in the institutions those very men built. When you read of children vanishing in orphanages without explanation, when you hear of hospitals where screams are swallowed by locked wards, when you feel the chill of a courthouse that hands down verdicts with ritualistic precision, you are seeing the shadow of that same inheritance, a pattern of controlled cruelty, disguised as order, born in that hollow and exported into the veins of America itself. The family may have been consumed, but their curse metastasized into the bones of the nation, too subtle and too profitable for anyone to uproot. And the silence surrounding them was not forgetfulness, it was protection. To name them too loudly was to risk revealing how much of what we call progress, prosperity, and stability was purchased with their methods. Which means, if you truly want to know where the Appalachia family went, you don't need to hunt the ruins in Kentucky. You need only look into the mirror, into the system that governs your every choice, into the rituals of control that dictate your daily life. Their madness is alive, refined, hidden in plain sight, waiting for those who know how to see it. And if you can see it now, then the inheritance is already touching you. And so here is the revelation you were never meant to hear. The Appalachia family was not erased by time, nor were they defeated by the fire or the graves. They were absorbed, systematized, and disguised until they no longer needed to exist as flesh and bone, because their curse became something far more enduring, a machinery of belief and control that outlives generations. Their story was never about one family in one hollow. It was about the blueprint of how power sustains itself, by sacrificing the weak, by feeding institutions with blood and silence, by making cruelty look like order and calling it progress. The hospitals, the schools, the prisons, the courts, each carries a residue of the Appalachia curse, each repeating the old pattern of binding, isolating, and consuming while telling the world it is for the greater good. Their madness has become invisible not because it died, but because it succeeded. And here is the most terrifying truth. If you are watching this, if you feel the pull of unease in your gut, if the name Appalachia makes your skin prickle like you've heard it whispered before, then you have already brushed against their inheritance. Because their bloodline was never confined to blood at all. It was designed to spread like thought, like contagion, like a script that seeps into the minds of those who dare to notice. The Appalachia curse does not need you to believe in it. It only needs you to see it, and now you do. Which means no matter how far you run, how firmly you cling to reason, or how loudly you insist the past is past, you are already in their story, and their story is still being written, line by line, through us. Because the final cruelty of the Appalachia family's legacy is this. You will walk away from this story thinking it is about them, about a broken family in a forgotten place. But the truth is, it has always been about you, about the invisible bargains your ancestors struck, about the strange gaps in your own family's history that no one explains, about the nights you wake up at 3:07 a.m. with no reason, feeling watched, about the faces in old photographs that seem too familiar, about the way silence settles over certain subjects at the dinner table, about the rules no one writes down but everyone obeys, because their curse was never a tale to be told and forgotten. It was an infection of memory, seeded into the marrow of America itself, designed to replicate wherever fear, secrecy, and sacrifice meet. And now that you've heard it, you cannot unhear it, because the Appalachia curse does not end with the dead, it begins with the living, and the moment you acknowledge it, you've already carried it forward. And so the Appalachia curse lingers, not as a legend confined to mountain soil, but as a quiet machinery still grinding beneath the surface of modern life, a structure that feeds on silence, denial, and bloodline, ensuring that no one truly escapes its reach, because every generation unknowingly renews the contract through the choices they make in moments of desperation, through the secrets they bury in basements, through the names they dare not speak aloud. And if you trace your own lineage far enough, you will find gaps, blackouts, stories lost to time, not by accident, but by design. A hand cutting away the evidence so you never realize the same shadow that swallowed the Appalachia family has been brushing against your life as well, waiting, biding, patient as rot beneath painted wood. And the chilling truth is that while you listen to this story, it listens back, weighing you, measuring whether you will resist the silence or submit to it, because curses like this do not fade, they recruit. The deeper you peer into the bones of this story, the more you realize it was never about a single family or even a single century, but about a pattern woven so tightly into the American fabric that it feels invisible until you tug at the threads and watch the whole garment unravel. Whispered traditions of blood oaths traded in candlelit barns, unmarked graves that shift and sink no matter how often they're filled, songs sung low in dialects no longer spoken that somehow still carry the rhythm of mourning and sacrifice, and at the heart of it all, the unspoken commandment that nothing is to be spoken aloud, that silence itself is the offering demanded generation after generation, and those who break it are punished not with death, but with memory, with the unbearable clarity of seeing what the rest are spared from knowing. And that is why the Appalachia curse endures, not because it hides in shadows, but because it stands in plain daylight, daring you to notice, daring you to remember, daring you to carry its weight forward. And so it becomes clear that what began as a tale of madness and bloodline is in truth a map of power. Power built on fear, silence, and inheritance, the kind of power that seeps into the marrow of a place, until even the trees and rivers seem to conspire with it, shaping destinies, breaking families, rewriting truth itself. And when you listen closely, you hear the echo of every disappearance, every fever dream, every violent act attributed to insanity or chance, all folding back into the same hidden ledger, a record kept not on paper but in memory, in scars, in the way children shiver at night without knowing why. And this ledger binds the Appalachia family not only to their own cursed fate, but to the land that bore them, to the soil that drinks deep of blood and never grows clean, to the hills that hold secrets tighter than any vault, until the distant connection between victim and perpetrator, witness and participant, living and dead, is blurred, and the family's forgotten bloodline of madness becomes less a story of individuals than of a cycle, one that swallows generation after generation, leaving only the question of who among us has already been marked to continue it. Because cycles like these do not simply vanish, they mutate, adapt, slip into the shadows of new ages, wearing different masks, but carrying the same venom beneath the skin. And so the Appalachia family's curse does not end with their recorded tragedies, but lingers in whispers of neighbors who claim to see figures on porches long abandoned, in court records where sudden madness erupts in descendants who never knew their lineage, in the inexplicable violence that blooms like a weed in bloodlines thought to have severed ties, until scholars, folklorists, and men of faith alike admit there is something here that resists reason, something older than memory and stronger than blood, a contagion of mind and spirit that seeps into whoever dares come close. And it is in this persistence, this refusal to die, that we see the true terror. Not just that one family was consumed by darkness, but that darkness itself chose them as a vessel, and once it has a vessel, it does not let go. It reproduces through time, embedding itself in human flesh, and perhaps what we call madness, possession, or even genetic curse, is nothing more than the echo of that first bargain struck in silence, binding every soul that carries the Appalachia name to a fate that cannot be escaped, only delayed, only hidden, until it rises again to remind the living that some families are not simply forgotten, they are buried alive within history, waiting. And when the waiting ends, it never announces itself with fanfare, but with small fractures that grow into calamity. A child who begins to hum lullabies in a dialect no one recognizes, an heirloom mirror that refuses to reflect a face properly, a sudden fever that sweeps through a household yet leaves no trace in the blood, each incident too minor alone to sound the alarm, but together forming the same pattern that the earliest records hinted at, an inheritance of distortion, a tether between flesh and shadow, as if the Appalachia family carries in their marrow a map that leads not forward but backward into some primordial night, where bargains were made before the first church bell rang, before the first courthouse stood, and those bargains demand interest, always more than can be paid, always at the cost of sanity, trust, and life itself. And so it is not madness to fear them, but clarity, for to look upon their story is to glimpse the architecture of a curse that does not end, only adapts, pulling generation after generation into the same spiral, a spiral that perhaps does not belong only to them, but to every bloodline that thinks it has outrun its secrets. For the Appalachias stand as proof that blood remembers even when the mind forgets, and that nothing buried stays buried. Which is why the Appalachia family cannot be spoken of only as an isolated horror, a mountain clan sealed away in forgotten valleys, but rather as a living metaphor for the sickness that seeps through every society when it dares to hide its rot behind ceremony and silence. Because what they reveal is not just a family bound by unspeakable pacts, but a mirror held up to anyone who believes their own history has been cleansed, for the echoes of their curse resurface in the same way that national sins resurface, in fevers, in hauntings, in sudden cracks in the facade of civility, reminding us that time does not erase the crimes of ancestors. It incubates them, mutates them, and eventually demands payment in forms no one can predict. So when one studies the Appalachians, it is not just about tracing a genealogy of madness, but about facing the possibility that every family carries its own dormant terror, every community has its own unmarked grave, every bloodline whispers to itself in the dark, and only those who listen closely enough to those whispers can ever hope to understand why ruin comes not from outside, but from within, like a seed that, and so the whispers of the Appalachia family stretch far beyond their graves, weaving themselves into tavern tales, preacher warnings, and the hushed conversations of men who swore never to speak their names aloud, for their story has become less of a history and more of a contagion, passed mouth to ear like a forbidden secret, until it lives in the marrow of the land itself, a warning that every cabin, every church pew, every field where children play could conceal a rot that waits for the right season to bloom again, and the deeper you chase their legacy, the more you realize it is not confined to the hollers of Kentucky, but seeps into the very idea of America's hidden inheritance. For beneath the shining myths of pioneers and settlers lies the truth of hunger, cruelty, ritual, and the strange bargains desperate men and women made with forces they could never control. Which is why those who try to document the Appalachia family always end up sounding less like historians and more like prophets, their words trembling with the knowledge that what they uncovered was not just a tale of one bloodline, but a glimpse of the terrible cost of burying truth beneath silence. And once you hear it, truly hear it, the question is no longer whether the family was damned, but whether the curse they carried has already spread into you.